All right, in this segment, we're going to talk about the career of Antonioni from his color period on. I'll have Richard Pena for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll go it alone with Mike and Hamish. So let's talk, while with the time we have left with Richard, let me talk about the two other films that I had mentioned, Blow Up and Zabriskie Point. My brief comment on that, I think Blow Up is a great film. Zabriskie Point has great moments, but it's one of those kinds of art films that I could see sort of like with 2001: A Space Odyssey, people walking out of the theater going, "What the fuck?" So maybe Richard, if you would give your comments on both of those two films.
Well, I think Blow Up was kind of a very interesting film. It showed Antonioni able to sort of cross over into an entirely different milieu and continue to make, really fantastic cinema. Again, I think, for me, looking at it in the larger picture, I wouldn't call it a step down necessarily from the tetralogy, but it's a little bit of a step away. He's, I think, really now, as opposed to especially the last two films of the tetralogy, emphasizing his position as an outsider, as an observer. There was much more kind of collusion going on, and that was maybe a result, especially of his work with Beatty in those last two films of the tetralogy. Here, I think it's a very different case. It's really an observer looking from a distance, looking at that culture in a way. I mean, my favorite scene is the scene with the Yardbirds. I mean, I think that's just some of the most remarkable filming of a rock band ever. But the sense of kind of bobbing heads as the camera sort of tracks over them really, I think, captures something remarkable about that particular era. So, Blow Up, I think, is truly a film that has stood the test of time and continues to be thought of as among his greatest works. Zabriskie Point's a problematic film. I've grown to appreciate it more and more over the years. I was bitterly disappointed when I first saw it. I really liked Antonioni. Seeing it in later years, and perhaps after getting to know his work better, I've seen more to it in a way, and I think there are some terrific moments. I also think, again, based somewhat on my experience of the very nice exhibition that was done at the Cinematheque Française just a few months ago about Antonioni and modern art, that is one of the films where he most kind of, I think, reflects on the relationship between his work and a lot of contemporary art. And that exhibition made a very good series of points, both in his relationship to what we know is Antonioni's very strong interest in abstract expressionism and other sort of contemporary schools, and even pop art. So there's a way in which I think he, really, again, sort of that cinema of recherche, if it's not totally successful, was trying something new with a youth culture that fascinated him, but of which he most decidedly was not part of. So in that way, I think, perhaps there was a case where the distance got too much, or he didn't in the end really come to grips with it, or was unable to come to grips with it in a way that he certainly could back in Italy.
Mike Ross, what's your opinion of those two films, Blow Up first and then Zabriskie Point?
I greatly admire Blow Up, but it is a disconcerting change. For one thing, the protagonist is such an unsympathetic person in many ways. He treats women abominably. There's always been a protest against sexism. He is part of Antonioni's vision, and Leamica in the 50s deals with working women who often get treated really shabbily by men. So this is it's disturbing to watch him be so rotten to women in the film, and I think Antonioni's trying to make the audience squirm in some of those scenes. Maybe just a thought here. I agree that the London sequence in the end with the Yardbirds was terrific. It shows Antonioni always loves to film shop windows and get reflections in store windows and other kinds of windows, and he has a field day with photographing London in a visually creative way. There's beautiful clothes there. In some ways, the swinging 60s in London centered on Carnaby Street and the revolution in fashion that it created, and the Blow Up captures that enormous detail. All the people in Antonioni films tend to be very well dressed. In some ways, he's very much an art filmmaker who isn't trying to entertain. But in terms of costume and fashion throughout his films, these are, some of the best dressed Italians in the world. It's a side of Antonioni that comes to very much to the fore with all the wonderful costumes and clothes in London in the swinging 60s. There's lots of the park scene is fabulous. It's full of the curving lines, which are so important in Antonioni. And other films like Eventi, these tend to be curving roads, but here he's got a whole park that's built out of curvilinear forms, and he has a field day photographing it in creative ways. It's just very interesting.
There's a famous line from an Emerson essay called Nature that goes something like, "I became a transparent eyeball, and all around me ran currents through me," or something like that. And I always think of that line in Blow Up, because I think that the Hemmings character is such a cipher, because we're supposed to sort of look through him at his kind of world. He is sort of almost like a placeholder, I think, for the audience, because every man is going to want to, boff all the supermodels that he's doing. Every guy is going to want to have his swinging lifestyle in that era. It would be the equivalent, I guess, of, well, I guess it's gotten even more vapid in the last 50 years. Hamish, do you see the character that Hemmings plays as sort of a stand-in for sort of a male fantasy in that film?
Look, obviously he is a very unsympathetic character. The other way to think about him, I guess, is the way some critics have, as a sort of stand-in for the director. This is the argument that Blow Up is Antonioni's 8.5. And on certain levels, it is, I think. But if that's true, then it's pretty remarkable that he uses such an unattractive figure, at the center of this story. Of course, Guido in 8.5 is a womanizer as well, etc. But he's, somewhat more kind of sympathetically drawn. I guess what's most striking to me about this film is that in some ways the film looks forward and backwards. I think it looks forward, as I've already mentioned, to what we call New Hollywood. And I say that for a very particular reason, that Blow Up achieved something that very few films have achieved. It was a huge hit, and it was, quote unquote, an art film. And that is something that, the whole generation of early 1970s New Hollywood directors tried to do. And it's very difficult to do. It's nearly impossible to do. And Blow Up is almost the prototype, I would argue. But the film also looks back, excuse me, in the sense that it returns to some of the 1950s interests of Antonioni's, particularly around everyday popular culture, both at the level of image production, so here obviously the photographer, and image consumption and kind of, I guess you could say proliferation through the culture. So in the tetralogy, although those things are there, in a sense, they're in the background to some extent, I would argue. With Blow Up, Antonioni is diving back into this world. And to go along with that, to kind of echo what's already been said, or implied, I think, the film is certainly, well, I would argue, a step back in terms of aesthetic interest and innovation and radicalization. It's almost the beginning of Antonioni's phase where he tries to, very successfully in many ways, mainstream his style of filmmaking for an English language, in fact, Hollywood mode, if you like. And for me, that's kind of historically interesting, but at least I think now Blow Up I wouldn't put Blow Up in the top tier of his films in terms of films that are consistently interesting and kind of staggering on a compositional level. But I would certainly agree with what the other two guys have said about the Yardbird sequence. I often show that clip in classes. It's an absolutely fabulous sequence.
Hamish, would you say that Blow Up was more influential in America than in Europe? Because you have Coppola's Conversation and then Blow Out, and then you have just decades of lesser thriller type films in America that make use of that kind of thing. Whereas I'm not as familiar with European films. So do you think that Blow Up had more of an influence in America than it did elsewhere?
Yes, broadly, I would say so. Partly for the reasons I've enunciated, because it is in a sense a film that fuses two traditions of filmmaking very successfully. But if we look to the broader story and what I started talking about at the beginning of this conversation, the global influence of Antonioni on filmmakers from all over the world, it's not Blow Up that they're talking about. It's the early 60s films, and even to some extent Zabriskie Point. It's the films that really, really push the radical edges of feature filmmaking in terms of the use of space and time and composition. I mean, look, none of which is to deny that Blow Up isn't a great film. It is, but for me, it's a little bit more of historical interest, perhaps, than it is a film that would really blow, say, my students away. Yeah.
How about Zabriskie? What's your opinion on that, quickly?
Oh, look, I actually prefer it on the whole. To me, Zabriskie Point is aesthetically and in terms of composition by far his most interesting English language film. I think maybe Mike was talking about the interest in American pop art and the way in which he manages, in his one fully American film, he manages to really engage in an interesting way. I think not only with the kind of the politics of the moment, but also a whole kind of tradition of American avant-garde art, which had fascinated him for many, many years. And he got a chance to, I think, work, as it were, closer to the source. What fascinates me is that Zabriskie Point was, received the most appalling reviews in the United States when it came out, and even many of Antonioni's biggest defenders kind of dropped him like a hot potato. And I just can't help thinking that part of that is that the film is on a certain level a pretty extreme denunciation of a certain kind of dominant, American, vision. He's not fully on board with the counterculture, but there's no doubt, I think, that the film is still very sympathetic to that overall critique of the United States. So for me, it is one of actually the most successful films to riff on that crucial moment halfway through the Vietnam, the occupation of Vietnam by the US and the bombing thereof, that really explored the fault lines of the United States that are actually irreconcilable. So for me, it's actually a really major film.
All right. Well, thank you, Hamish. Let's let Richard go. Richard Payne, if you want to have a final comment before you go.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Well, we are back with Hamish and Mike Gross. Richard Pena had to leave. So I wanted to talk a bit about the post-Zabriskie Antonioni. I've only seen two films, Identification of a Woman and The Passenger, but the next film, I believe one of you had mentioned the documentary on China. And let me start with Mike, since you had some interesting comments about his documentary work. Tell me about what is it, Chengguo China. I've never seen just a handful of small clips on YouTube.
I apologize. I've only seen a bit on YouTube too.
Okay.
There's a version with only Italian narration and language I unfortunately don't speak, so I felt I wasn't giving it a fair view.
Okay.
I could see his interest in umbrellas. Antonioni loves umbrellas, and he shows street scenes in Beijing where there's big shady umbrellas, just like he had in Italy 20 years previous to that in Evinti. So it's not to mention the umbrellas near the lights in David Hemming's studio in Blow Up. So you can see little motifs. There's interesting photography of Chinese buildings. What Zhonghua is like as a whole is completely unclear to me.
All right, Hamish, maybe you can fill in some of the blanks about the China documentary for us.
Well, I think it's important just for a moment to go back to Zabriskie Point, because these two films were the most disastrous films, well, in some ways, of his career, or the most important disastrous films of his career. Critically, you mean? Sorry?
Critically or financially?
Critically, yeah, and in very comparable ways. So Sam Brody in his book describes the Chinese response to Chengguo China. Of course, what he means by that is the official government response, because Chinese people were not able to see the film for a very long time. He describes the Chinese response as being as stupid and narcissistic as the American response to Zabriskie Point. And what he means is that in both of these films, Antonioni is making a perceived, and in some ways real, attack on the given society or political system that he, of his hosts, right? Now, I think, as we've been discussing for a long time, Antonioni is a very subtle filmmaker. So to the extent that he's a political filmmaker, it's nothing close to being a kind of dogmatic, ideological kind of, regard response. Nonetheless, I think the enormous commercial and critical failure of Zabriskie Point in the United States hamstrung his career from there on in. He would find it very difficult to mount projects. The heyday of European art cinema in the 1950s and 60s as a commercial entity was coming to an end, including in Europe. So it was very difficult, not only Antonioni, but Fellini and Bergman found it increasingly hard to rely upon the same funding structures. So they had to resort to different, often involving television, different kind of mechanisms. So Antonioni making a TV documentary is not that unusual, but certainly the response to it was. If we look at the film itself, it's really very difficult to see now what was so offensive about it. In fact, if you watch the film, which is an absolutely stunning film, it's a very affectionate movie, not only about what he encountered in China on a kind of human level, but even, I would argue, on a kind of developmental level. He portrays particularly the big cities in China as very developed, as very peaceful, as seemingly being run in a way that, has a certain kind of harmony to it. This, of course, is towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. Having said that, of course, there are moments in the film where it's been read as very much kind of suggesting a critique of a kind of a surface placidity. But we have to remember that, as I think Mike was saying a long time ago, Antonioni's interest is very much in the question of the surface and how we often interpret way too much. We assume way too much based on what we can see. So one of the wonderful things about Junko China is the way in which Antonioni foregrounds very much a theme that is throughout his work, which is the encounter with the other. So he shows up in China, he can't speak the language, and he doesn't claim for a moment to educate us about China. What he does claim to give us is an encounter between him and his Italian crew and this extraordinary country and this extraordinary experiment in communism. And on a very playful level, it's also a story of an encounter between his very Antonioni-esque camera and individual Chinese people who play literally a kind of almost a game of cat and mouse or hide and seek with the gaze. Finally, what's really striking is he's working with a new cinematography here, but the framing and the whole aesthetic surface of the film is perhaps surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, of a piece in many respects with his other work. So yeah, I definitely recommend seeing it.
Well, let's move on to The Passenger, Professione Reporter, as I guess it was known in Europe. That starred Jack Nicholson, and this is when Nicholson had really become a big star. I think, was this made before or after Cuckoo's Nest?
I think before.
Yeah. So that's another interesting film. I personally don't rank it up with some of the films of the 60s. Maybe Mike, if you want to talk about it to kick us off.
I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's stronger visually than as a story or as a screenplay.
Yeah.
And when I first saw it, I was underwhelmed when it came out. But when I've seen it in recent years, I've been impressed with the visuals that Antonioni has managed to gather. There's beautiful scenes like the opening desert with the rocks is very striking. Is going to the Antonioni Gaudi buildings in Barcelona and filming them is not to be missed. Many things like that. It's if you pay less attention to the story and more attention to what's going on screen as a series of images, it becomes a more interesting and creative movie. So it's somewhat mixed feelings there.
How about you, Hamish? Your thoughts on that film?
What we really get with The Passenger, I think, is something that I alluded to earlier with Blow Up, whereas Blow Up influenced New Hollywood. The Passenger is the closest Antonioni ever got to making a New Hollywood film. Now, that's despite the fact that the film is not set in the United States, but I think the presence of Nicholson, and just more generally the tone of the film, and even to some extent the look of the film, I think is closer, or at least more of a piece to a certain kind of pre-Jaws, early 70s Hollywood moment. But I think the most important thing for our present discussion is maybe to think about the film as, and I do like the film, but it is to some extent a kind of simulation of an Antonioni film. And I mean by that two things. First of all, the genesis of the film was not with him. So it was a film written by a bunch of people, including a British film theorist by the name of Peter Wallen, who wrote some famously kind of, difficult semiotic film theory in the early 70s. And they wanted to literally write a quote-unquote Antonioni film and find someone to direct it. And then finally they got the real deal. Antonioni was trying to mount a project called Technically Sweet, I believe was the title, which fell over very close to going into production. And he, in a sense, on The Passenger was a director for hire. Now, he did contribute to the screenplay, but in a much less prominent way to previously. And it's the closest we get to Antonioni as a Hollywood director. So, in other words, more in the Hollywood mode of the director is a hired guy who comes in and applies his, potential authorship to the film. I think that's one way to look at it. But the final thing I'd say about this notion of simulation is that there's almost a sense of a slightly parodic version of an Antonioni film here that he himself had been riffing on, I believe, for a long time. So I think as early as La Notte, there are almost little excessive moments, are slight little in-jokes in the film, particularly some of the more po-faced moments with Modigliani. And I think Antonioni was a director with a very sly sense of humour about a sort of, almost quoting himself in a kind of slightly sly way. With The Passenger, I think that the entire film perhaps could be seen in this way. Having said that, there's an interest in the film on post-colonial and anti-colonial politics and war in North Africa, which is very interesting and very elusive. And I think in many ways The Passenger is actually his most political film in an overt way. Yeah.
So, Hamish, was this sort of a funding thing in the way that Kurosawa tried to do Tora, and then did Dersu Uzala, getting funding wherever he could and work wherever he could?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, as I mentioned before, Zabriskie Point in many ways didn't destroy his career, but it curtailed his career. So the rest of his career was really a history of unfunded projects to a large degree. Having said that, as I've already mentioned, all of the famous directors from his generation struggled, be they European or, as you say, Kurosawa in Japan, struggled for funding. So they had to resort to television or various international co-productions with not necessarily always happy results. So those two things, I think that the disaster of Zabriskie Point critically and commercially in the US and that sort of that broader drying up of European art cinema as a kind of institution is very important.
Well, okay, let's move on then to, I'm looking at his final four films, Mystery of Oberwald, Identification of a Woman, Beyond the Clouds, and then it looks like he did a segment in one of those kind of collaborative films called The Dangerous Thread of Things. I've only seen Identification of a Woman. I thought it was a good, solid film. Again, I thought it was sort of what you might call an old man's film. It's sort of, if you look at Bergman's later films, or if you look at Kurosawa's last 3 or 4 films, it's someone who was doing a film that you can see hints of what the grandeur before, but realistically, it is certainly a step down. So let me start with you, Mike. Let's tackle those 4 films if you want in a row. Do you have any comments on any of those final 4 films, Mike, that we can kick this off with?
I think Beyond the Clouds is a very nice movie. It's not as great a film as the tetralogy, but it's it looked to me like Antonioni was attempting to recapture some of the visual beauty in a cinematic approaches and technical approaches he used in the tetralogy, and that he came back with a very nice, visually beautiful movie that will appeal to anybody who loves Antonioni. It's not as great. It's a miracle it was made at all. He had spent years recovering from serious strokes. He was a very fragile person and difficulty with communication, but he still managed to make this beautiful, joyous movie that I think everyone would like, and you can see a long list of parallels between individual shots in it in La Ventura. There's a sense that he goes back to a lot of the old towns that in La Ventura, the characters spend a lot of times wandering around the south of Italy and old towns and being beautifully photographed. They do that here too in Beyond the Clouds. There's other shots that recall the walk in Milan and La Notte. It's just a nice movie that I think people would like. I was less impressed by the short film Eros he made, which I think is part of one of those combination films where each director does a different chapter. It's perfectly inoffensive, but I don't think it's as successful as Beyond the Clouds.
How about Oberwald or Identification of a Woman? Any comments on those?
I have not seen those.
Okay.
And I really should try. Oberwald is very hard to find anywhere, and Identification of a Woman is just a film I shamefully have not watched. It's out on DVD.
Okay. How about you, Hamish? Comments on these 4 films that I was talking with Mike of?
Well, the Oberwald mystery is a real oddity. I mean, it's Antonioni's only period film. It's full of kind of flowery, pre-20th century sort of affectations. I mean, it's an adaptation of a Cocteau play, but it's set in this, very pre-modern kind of environment. And it was made for television. He found it, The Passenger was not a huge success commercially, so he found it even more difficult to fund his projects than previously. And so he made this for TV. The most interesting thing about it, or 2 things, is Monica Vietti's back, and she's fabulous actually in the film. There are certain thematic connections to his previous work, issues around kind of knowledge and the gaze that we've talked about. But most strikingly, connecting the film with Red Desert, he uses what was then cutting edge or relatively cutting edge color mixing, so that as the film was being shot, I believe it wasn't post-production, I believe it was live, although I'm happy to be corrected by somebody on that. He actually would manipulate the color of the image in incredibly radical ways. So, the architecture of a building will be sort of blue at the beginning of the shot, and he'll sort of turn half of it red or something, in the concluding moments. So it's an interesting experiment, but it's a kind of an oddity, and then mainly of interest to Antonioni sort of diehards, I guess. Identification of a Woman obviously is much more connected to the tradition that he works in. To me, what begins though, Identification of a Woman, and I've already suggested that this starts with The Passenger. The Passenger is that he starts to make what I think he will do for the rest of his life, which is make sort of copies of Antonioni films to some extent. Identification of a Woman is like a less challenging, less fabulous, much less fabulous version of the famous early 60s films. I like it. It's one of the, it's one of the best Italian films I've seen from the 80s, but it's kind of like a very pale, rather mainstream version of the tetralogy films, and it begins what will go through right to the end of his career when it comes to Eros, which is a growing fascination with a very kind of almost exploitation level kind of soft porn treatment of human bodies, particularly women.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and in our final segment, we'll talk about the later years, death, and legacy of Antonioni, as well as giving both Hamish and Michael closing remarks, and we'll do that in a moment. All right. I think it was quite an interesting show talking about one of the great world directors. I want to talk in this final segment about the final years and critical reactions over the decades to Antonioni, and then give both Hamish and Mike their closing remarks. I want to actually, though, begin this segment because online, if you look up in Google Bergman and Antonioni, I find it very interesting that Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish film director, had some really, really bad comments, really derogatory comments about a lot of the work of Antonioni. And if you Google the two men, you can probably see about 4 or 5 clips, maybe totaling about 15 minutes. And the reason I bring it up is because, to me, in terms of how they viewed humanity, Bergman and Antonioni are very similar. The only difference is I think Bergman used a microscope on humanity, where he would get close up, not only physically with the camera and almost look into the eye or the cracks in someone's skin, whereas Antonioni was looking through a telescope. If I were to compare the two, it's almost like if I was to look at a painter's, Bergman was someone like maybe a Matisse, almost obsessed with the close up of human forms, whereas Antonioni is one of those great Hudson Valley painters from America in the 19th century, where the human beings are small little things on the landscape just to serve a larger purpose. And but the attitudes both men had towards humanity seemed very similar. Let me start with you, Hamish. Would you agree that the two men had similar views on humanity, even though they portray them differently in their films? And what do you think accounts for Bergman's comments so derisively towards Antonioni?
Well, to start with the latter, I think it's mainly about actors. He thought wrongly, in my view, that Monica Vitti was a terrible actor, and Bergman said that Antonioni made two masterpieces, La Notte and Blow Up. I'm not sure how he forgives David Hemming's acting if he's going to be so hard on Vitti, but nonetheless. So for him, Antonioni was, not necessarily a kind of an innovator, I guess. But also, I think Bergman also commented that Antonioni was on the way to greatness, but I think the quote was, expired under the weight of his own tediousness. The fact is that Bergman's movies are actually full of much more going on in the obvious sense. So there's more action, and I don't mean that in the Hollywood sense, but there's more development of characters. There's more development of kind of situations that people can grab onto. There's the tenor of Bergman's films is an incredible intensity. Antonioni is almost the opposite, with obvious exceptions depending on what film and sequence we're looking at. So Antonioni requires a much more patient, a much more detached attitude in some ways. Bergman is, for me, radically different. I've written about Bergman as much, or probably even more than Antonioni. They're my two favourite directors for a very long time. But Bergman is all about what I call radical intimacy, and really, I guess you were just talking about that, Dan, before, this notion of the microscope. He gets the camera and the viewer so close, literally, but also kind of metaphorically, to the human body that it's almost too much to bear. Antonioni is always kind of tempted to head in the opposite direction. The other difference, I guess, I'd mention is that Antonioni, from the beginning of his career, is completely disinterested in questions of religion. And that's not to say that the church and religion doesn't play a role in his films, but it plays a fairly minor role, and it's only there as a sort of anthropological detail. Whereas Bergman comes out of this very religious environment, and he spends much of his career up until roughly The Silence, 1963, battling with that heritage and then kind of exorcising it, if you like. But he spends the rest of his career, at least in my view, applying the same blowtorch that he did to the kind of the heritage of religion to all these other modern institutions like the family, the Swedish state, and all kinds of things. So for me, they're actually very different filmmakers. Bergman is white hot, I think, whereas Antonioni is cool. But I'd agree with you on the really broad point that they are two absolute masters of post-war European cinema in charting the crises, the increasing crises of Western modernity as the pre-war promises and the post-war kind of hopefulness gave way to a whole lot of new problems.
Mike, do you have any comments on Bergman and Antonioni?
No, I apologize. I know very little about Bergman and can't compare the two at all.
Okay, well, let's talk then about the critical reaction in his heyday, his later years, and now here in the 21st century. Let me start with you, Hamish. Where has he gone? Because we know all artists, whether they're painters or poets or writers, tend to go through waxing and waning phases over the decades and centuries. Where has Antonioni been, and where do you think he will be going as we head towards the end of this century?
Well, it's interesting. He and Bergman were not only roughly contemporaries; they were, I think, 6 years apart in age. Bergman's first feature film is 1945, Antonioni's is 1950. And they've actually suffered a very similar critical fate, at least to a point.
And didn't they die on the same day?
They died within 24 hours.
Yeah, it's sort of like Jefferson and Adams here, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams here in America, the founding fathers. I could imagine Antonioni, but Bergman still lives.
I was teaching. I had a new job teaching up here, and when I heard the first bit of news, it was bad enough. So Antonioni died first, and that was shattering enough. And then my girlfriend actually told me Bergman's died, and I said, no, darling, you must mean Antonioni. She went, no, it's actually Bergman. And I'm like, this is too horrific to be true. Of course, they were both old, and they completed their work. But getting back to the question of critical ups and downs, Antonioni was obviously much admired in many countries throughout the 1960s. Interestingly, in Italy, his reputation was up and down very much. What happened, though, is that as the 70s ground on, and certainly by the 80s, both of those filmmakers were increasingly out of fashion. They represented a certain kind of, ennui, kind of angst-ridden, almost kind of cliched image of European art cinema that was just not in keeping with the tenets of film studies and more broadly film culture that had entered what a lot of people now call, the so-called postmodern era, where everything was much more about a kind of a much less serious engagement with history and reality, and much more about pure play with aesthetic surfaces. Interestingly, of course, Blow Up, according to many people, including the wonderful Hungarian film scholar András Bálint-Kovács in his 2007 book on modern European cinema of the post-war period, he argues that Blow Up in many ways is the first postmodern film. But of course, it's still got a foot very much in the modernist camp as well. But during the 80s and 90s, Antonioni and Bergman, their stocks plummeted in many respects in many countries. And it wasn't really until the late 90s when that started to change with Antonioni, although again, I'd go back to Sam Rodey's book from 1990 as a crucial indicator that somebody was interested in writing a book about this guy again. Seymour Chapman's book had come out in the late 80s, so that played a role as well. But certainly since, I'd say, around about the late 90s, there's been a snowballing of interest in Antonioni's work and career, much more solidly actually than Bergman. So I would argue today it's much more Bergman who is undervalued than Antonioni as a kind of contributor to the story of narrative cinema.
Mike, any comments on the critical reactions to Antonioni?
Not really, and I very much enjoyed listening to Hamish's remarks and learned from them. Thank you.
Well, let's end this interview then. I'll give both of you an ability to say whatever you want for a few minutes. Mike, let me start with you. If you could just sum up your views or your opinions about Antonioni in a few minutes.
Antonioni is a visually creative filmmaker of enormous gifts. At his best, everything in his movie is full of striking compositions, camera movement, colors in his color work. He's very much a pictorial filmmaker. And that is part of a vast tradition that flows through. It flows through art films where you have directors like Rene and Varda and Godard being visually creative, but he's also in many ways surprisingly similar to Hollywood filmmakers who had pictorial gifts like John Ford, Joseph von Sternberg, Joseph H. Lewis, Vincent Minnelli, the Tourneurs, and to experimental filmmakers that are not often studied or mentioned. Antonioni's films do have some similarity to people like Gregory Markopoulos with Twice a Man, Willard Moss with Image in the Snow, Mike Cooker with films like Sins of the Fleshopoids. These are all filmmakers that, despite coming out of completely different worlds, having utterly different production histories, probably never meeting socially to each other, all their films, because of their tremendous pictorial qualities, have a lot more in common than one would think just reading the biographies of the directors. And it's something today I wish that the public as a whole were more interested in pictorially great films. It's to me, it's the core tradition in cinema, and one that I wish that the average educated person understood and appreciated and loved and viewed more.
Well, thanks, Mike Gross, and we'll end with Hamish Ford in a second. I just want to let people know that you can look below this video and you can find links to Mike's website and websites for the other fellows and their endeavors below this video. So, Hamish, let me end the interview with you. If you could just give a summary of your feelings about Antonioni and film.
Look, Mark's just really stressed the most important thing. You can watch an Antonioni film, if you don't speak Italian, you can watch it with the subtitles turned off, and depending on the film, but particularly the so-called tetralogy, and you get the film. You get, arguably 99% of the film. Now, I know that's almost a cliche. You can say that about some other filmmakers too, but what does make Antonioni's films, again, very different from, say, Bergman's, is that his characters, on the whole, are not very articulate. Even the well-educated sort of intelligentsia that we see in L'Avventura, L'Eclisse, etc., most of the film happens in the silences, or in what they don't say, or even in the fact that what they do say is not very important or necessarily interesting. When I was researching, the early days of researching my PhD on this sort of period of filmmaking, I watched a copy of L'Eclisse at MoMA in New York. And the Charles Charles Silver, the wonderful guy in charge at that time, I think he's still there. He apologised deeply the fact that they couldn't find a subtitled version of the film, but the version they did have was a beautiful 35mm print. So I watched the film, and this was in 1999, and I'd only seen the film on television and on a pretty bad 16mm print. Watching that thing on 35mm with inky blacks, Gianni Di Vincenzo's cinematography, no subtitles, was the most sublime 2 hours of my film-going life to this day. Because, as Mark's just said, with Antonioni, really everything is in the image. He actually makes films that, in some ways I understand this argument that they get back to the foundational principles of cinema before sound, which is not to say that Antonioni's sound is not incredibly important. We've barely talked about it in this discussion, but his mastery of what we call diegetic sound or real sound or the mixing thereof is absolutely masterful. But the images, much more than dialogue, is where the action is for him, which of course is also why Antonioni is of immense influence to a certain tradition of film theory that associates itself with phenomenology, which is the study of bodies in real space and how to understand human experience and subjectivity through the body and its physical placement in very particular environments. So I think Mark really hit it on the head. It's interesting, I was teaching Jean-Luc Godard the other week to first years, and the great British critic Geoffrey Noel Smith starts a chapter in his book on Godard by writing, Jean-Luc Godard is the most important and revolutionary filmmaker of the last 50 years. Now, in a sense, I think that's certainly true. It's almost uncontroversial. But I think if we take a longer view and a more global view, you can argue, I think, that Antonioni in some ways is the most important and influential director, and to some extent also the most revolutionary director in the feature film. I think his influence actually goes far further than Godard's, although Godard's hugely important. I think Antonioni's influence floods almost everything, including, as we've sort of hinted at, Hollywood itself. If you look at 1970s Hollywood cinema, but even many films made subsequently in the United States, the influence is clear. The way in which shots are staged, de-emphasizing a kind of anthropocentric tradition of the frame, so no longer is the human presence necessarily the crucial thing to be looking at. The way in which architecture and different spaces impact upon people's psychology, and the way in which, of course, their behaviour changes fundamentally based on the context and the social and historical context in which they're behaving. All of this, many filmmakers, of course, have played with these ideas, but I think Antonioni is one of the absolutely key figures to have really brought this to a level of, as Mark was saying, in many ways, a purely visual, compositional principle. The last thing I want to say, I guess, is that his films, I think more than any other filmmaker that I can think of, in no way are less interesting the more you watch them. In many ways, they get better. When I'm choosing clips, or even when I was shuttling through a few films earlier on tonight, just a few of the films I hadn't seen for a while, it's like you want to watch the whole thing. You start to watch a scene and you just get absolutely sucked into these velvety kind of, not only blacks and whites, but colours and greys, and the textures of his films are so tantalising. Yet, I think as Richard or maybe Mike was saying earlier, scholars love Antonioni, but we also find it quite difficult in a way to put our finger on exactly what's so great about these films. We all try, but I'm not sure we ever quite get there. So luckily, it's the last thing I'll say, the films will always be greater than anything that any of us have to say about them.
Well, thanks, Hamish. Just a few comments. For me personally, Godard is one of those people that I think in 100 years, film critics are going to be snickering at the people who overrated him so much. I think in every art there's one of those things, and I could go on for hours about that. But getting back to Bergman, I wanted to just clarify the association I made between Bergman and Antonioni is I think both of those filmmakers, their characters are sort of philosophical zombies, because when Bergman does zoom in close and you listen to these well-educated people talk, they're emotionally inert. They're dead inside. There's no there in those characters. And my wife has always commented that that's one of the things, that these people who are so educated do the dumbest things in each of the films. And so that's what I was meaning by the sense that Bergman's characters are very similar, I think, to Antonioni's. The difference is Antonioni doesn't really give a shit, so he's gonna sort of get away from the stench of it all, whereas Bergman loves the stench in a sense. And the final comment before I end, I had mentioned to Mike in one of the breaks, and I just wanted to say it here. I think that Red Desert is a much better entree into color for Antonioni than Bergman's Cries and Whispers, which I think is a mess of a film. But I want to thank both Hamish and Mike Ross, and also Richard Pena, who left us earlier, for a really good conversation about one of the more important, not only filmmakers, but I think one of the more important artists of the 20th century, Michelangelo Antonioni. And I think in 300 or 400 years, the two other Michelangelos, Buonarroti and Caravaggio, I think he's going to be considered as important an artist as they are. I honestly do. And anyone who enjoyed this show on film and yesterday's show on film on Woody Allen's career, next week I will be talking about science fiction and poetry, and I hope that you will, viewers will tune in there. So again, thanks to Hamish and Mike.
Oh, no, thank you, Dan, for organising it, and to Michael and Richard for a really enjoyable conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Dan and Hamish and Richard, very, very much. It was a great privilege to take part in this.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.